Perform administration via Unisphere. We're going to first start off with the initial configuration wizard. After you've set up the Unity VSA and deployed it, you have to go through this configuration in order to get the environment initially configured and ready to go for your consumption. So let's start with the setup and basic system level configurations of a Unity VSA. The first thing we want to do is we want to navigate to the Unisphere interface via a web console. So in our case, we're going to go to our Unity VSA via the address 192.168.55.104. You're presented with the continue to this web page not recommended certificate warning. The certificate warning is very common. This is using a self-signed cert, so your machine doesn't understand the certificate authority chain that's available on this particular unit. So since we know this is a safe and acceptable website, we're going to go ahead and click continue to this web page. You're going to be presented with a login screen. The default credentials are admin, and then password, capital P, ASSWORD, 123, and then the hashtag symbol, or pound. Once you've typed that in, go ahead and click login. It'll take just a moment to go ahead and load the screen for the first time, so have a little bit of patience in order to make sure that you don't cause any type of issues with that initial configuration wizard. You can restart it later if you wish by going through the settings of the Unity VSA, but let's just have some patience the first time we start up to make sure that we can get through this configuration without any issues. So here you'll see the initial configuration wizard. In this wizard, we're going to have a lot of different options and capabilities for us to configure right off the bat. And when we do that, we want to make sure that we validate what each particular setting means and make sure that we're putting in the correct information the first time if possible. There is available online basic install and deployment documentation that gives you all the information you need to gather ahead of time and make available when you're doing this configuration. So feel free to seek that out from support.emc.com and then going to the community forums and searching for initial configuration documentation, and you'll be able to locate that and be able to use it as a template for the information that you're going to need to gather prior to this initial configuration wizard. So when you first launch the configuration wizard, you get this screen that just states what we're simply doing here. So let's click next past this. The next screen is about copyright. So take the time to read the copyright information. It tells you what is available and not available to you as the consumer of this product. Once you've determined that you accept the license agreement, go ahead and select Accept License Agreement and click Next. One of the first things that we want to change as part of this configuration is the password to get into the unit. Because of the fact that you don't want to use default credentials whenever possible, you want to set your own credentials, I would take the opportunity now to go ahead and get those changed so we can validate and move forward. And we don't have any worry about security cleanup after we've done this deployment. So for this particular case, I'm going to use pass with a capital P, ASS123 hashtag. So we have something similar to the original default for the sake of our demo. The checkbox below the password and the confirm password fields says set service password the same as admin password. So there's a service password that you can use in this environment. Depending on your security policies and your desire for password complexities, you can set your service account to something different. That service password is often used for something like powering down or rebooting the Unity VSA. So protecting that information is integral. You want to make sure that you have that saved in a password safe somewhere, stored securely, and you don't have a lot of people that have access to it. Oftentimes what I suggest to people, and as a best practice configuration, would be to set an admin password, make it pretty complex, and then set a separate service password and have it be pretty complex as well. A pretty common or standard password length is to do something like a 25 character mixed case, numeric, punctuation, completely random type of password, and then store that into a secured password safe. That way, number one, people aren't tempted to use it on a regular basis. They want to use their own individual credentials so you can track and audit log your activity on your array. But also it's going to be significantly more difficult to hack if someone were to try to. For the case of our demo though, we're going to leave set service password the same as the admin password checked so we can use the same thing as before. So let's go ahead and click next to continue. On some of these screens where you see a processing pop-up and you see a spinning dial, the reason it's happening is because it's doing some type of configuration step in the background. So in our particular case, since we just set the admin password, it's going through and it's processing, trying to set that credential information on the backside before it does a refresh and displays updated information. Now you're presented with the Unisphere licensing screen. You'll notice there's a couple different areas on this screen. First one is the system UUID. That UUID is the unique identifier for this particular storage system. So every time you do a new deployment of a Unity VSA, it's going to generate a new system UUID. So you can never use the same licensing key twice because each one will have a unique value, and that licensing key is based off of that value. First thing we can do is we can go click on the link that says Get License Online or obtain your license file from EMC support. What we want to do in our case, because we're going to go ahead and register this as a community edition, we're going to highlight the system UUID and copy it. What we're going to do is go to an EMC document on the community forum. That document number, as of today, is 53007, and that document references the Unity VSA License Installation Guide. If you are not able to find this particular document number, you'll want to search for something similar in the forums to locate the License Installation Guide so you can generate a license for the Community Edition. So in our case, we want to go down to the Procedure section. We've already got our UUID, and what we need to do is generate a license file. So we're going to click on the link for the License Management System download page. When you click on the link, it's going to present you with a login for the EMC support forum. You're going to want to go ahead and enter in your support information. If you don't have a support account, it is free to create one, so go ahead and create a support account and utilize that to gain access. What we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and paste in our Unity VSA UUID, and then from the product area, we're going to select Unity VSA. Once we've done that, we'll click Submit. It'll take a moment to generate the license file, but once we have the license file available to us, we can click on Download, or in my case, I'm going to right-click and do Save Target As, and we're going to save this file down with a .lic extension on it, and click Save. Once you've saved the license file down to your local machine, go ahead and go back to your Unisphere interface, and we're going to click on the Install License button. You're presented with the Install License screen. You'll notice up in the corner, there's a statement that says the file being selected must have a suffix of .lic. That's the reason we decided to go ahead and save our file as a .lic prior to doing this selection. So let's click on Browse and navigate to where that file is. Once you have your file selected, go ahead and click on Finish. At that point, the Unity VSA will start to upload the license file that you generated and added. It'll take just a minute for it to process through and make sure that we've got it added to the Unity VSA. Once the results display, it'll tell you if it was successful or not. In our particular case, we have successfully installed the license file onto the unit. So let's go ahead and click Close to exit out of this sub-wizard. Once you close out of the sub-wizard window, you'll see we come back to the initial configuration window, and we're going to take just a moment. It's going to load or refresh the information from that sub-wizard. You'll notice already in the background, there's a little green check mark, and it says license file installed successfully. So we have to wait just a moment for it to finish the refresh process, and we'll see that back in the initial configuration wizard, we're green and ready to go. So let's go ahead and click on Next to continue. We are now presented with the domain name system server addresses, or DNS addresses. So there's two ways to be able to configure your DNS. You can either obtain it automatically if you set up your Unity VSA with DHCP. In our particular case, we did not, so we have to configure DNS server addresses manually. The thing you have to make sure that you do is you have to add valid addresses. If you do not, it will fail in this wizard and it will not allow you to move forward with a valid DNS entry. So we're going to add two addresses here, 192.168.55.5 and .6. These are the two DNS servers for my test environment. Once they've been added, we're going to go ahead and click Next. What happens is it applies those addresses to the infrastructure, and it processes through and validates that those are correct. So you'll notice across the top, there's a yellow bar that says job created, and it's doing a modification of DNS settings. It's going to go through percentages, and it's going to finish up and let us know that it was successful or not. Let's go ahead and watch and see what it does here, but it should apply within the first few seconds after clicking the next button on the previous screen. Now the job is complete. So the next thing we want to do is we want to configure a network time protocol server, or NTP server. The same thing applies here. We got to make sure that we use a valid address in order to be successful with this configuration setting. So once we click the Add button, we're presented with an Add NTP Server screen. We want to add it by IP address or hostname. It is always best to add something by hostname instead of IP address, just for the sake of simplicity. What we're going to do for our configuration is we're going to enter 0.pool.ntp.org, which is a pretty standard NTP source. In your environment, use the NTP server or service that's the most appropriate for your configuration. So we're going to click Add, and in our case, we're going to add a second NTP source. It's going to be 1.pool.ntp.org. So that's another server that's in the pool, another DNS entry. So let's click Next to apply our NTP servers to the environment. The initial configuration of a Unity VSA, while fairly simple, is going to take some time. So don't expect that you're just going to blow through this configuration super quickly, because every configuration change that you make as part of this initial config wizard is going to take a few seconds each time, up to a minute sometimes, to apply that configuration, do validation, and then present you with the results of the config. So in this case, the NTP servers have to go out. They have to do a time protocol request to those NTP sources and validate that it can pull back accurate NTP information. So depending on your configuration, depending on your DNS response time, many different factors, this particular step may take a good portion of time. So be patient, wait for it to finish. You'll notice our NTP configuration is complete. It's got a green check mark next to NTP servers. Now it's time for our storage pool configuration. Because we want to get through the basic configuration of the Unity VSA first, and then deal with our storage configuration, we're going to ignore this particular screen of the initial configuration wizard, and we're going to move on to the next section and worry about setting up alert settings. We will create our storage pools at a later time. We're just not going to do it as part of this initial configuration. I would do this in a production deployment as well, just because I want to go through and make sure that I really have my mind wrapped around all the basic configuration settings before I go making changes to the storage config. That just makes it more simplistic from a configuration standpoint. When you're applying different settings and gathering information that's appropriate, you don't have to worry about going through creating new virtual disks and making a bunch of changes in the environment while you're going through this initial config wizard. The pools are a simple thing that you can set up after this is done. So we're going to go ahead and click Next to continue. This screen is your alert settings screen. The alert settings screen gives you several different options. The first is you can send email alerts to an email list or a grouping of personnel or people, or to a distribution group, or whatever you have set up for your environment for your alerting. So we want to start first by clicking on Add, and then we're going to add an email address. In my case, I'm going to add ryan@rashuge.com and click Add. So any email notifications that are going to be sent out are going to go to that address. You can have multiples. Feel free to set up as many as you want. Oftentimes I see people in a production environment send it to a distribution group, or send it even to a support mail queue and have that processed through their ticketing system. Now, the severity level of alerts to send. This section really talks about, how verbose or how much information do you want to get from your storage array. And if we're talking about severity, we have several different options. So if we click on the drop-down list, we see the listing there, which ranges from critical all the way to just informational. So we have critical, which is going to show us the most critical alerts, error and above, warning and above, notice and above, and then info and above. It defaults to notice and above because that's going to give you information like system updates that might be available, or configuration issues, or things that are just simply, hey, there might be something worth checking out, but it's nothing to be super concerned about. Info and above would be far too verbose for most configurations, so I would avoid it personally. If you want that kind of information, feel free to configure it that way. And if you really want to get down to the brass tacks of the situation, you can change it to critical. But I really feel in most configurations, you want to do a notice and above, as that's going to be the nice balance between verbose and informational. So we'll go ahead and confirm notice and above, and then we can go ahead and set up our SMTP server. In our case, that SMTP server is going to be the mail server that receives email from this particular unit and does a relay out to your messaging system. If you choose not to set that up, then none of your email alerts or SMTP settings are going to be valid. So make sure you take the time to configure this particular setting. You'll notice that there are no authentication options, so you will need to use an open authentication relay. You can use different tools in order to keep that communication secure by limiting it by IP address, watching the queue processing of that particular address, several different things you can do to limit your risk or exposure. But in this configuration with this version of the Unity VSA, you cannot apply credentials to that SMTP server. In our case, the SMTP server is going to be .80. So we're going to do 192.168.55.80. Once you have your SMTP server address entered, we're going to click Next. You will likely want to use a DNS name, not an IP address. But because of this configuration in my test lab, we are going to use a direct IP. So we'll click on Next to configure. Now we're presented with the iSCSI interfaces screen. This particular screen of the wizard allows you to set up your iSCSI interfaces. We are going to skip the configuration of this particular screen for now. We are going to add this configuration in a later module. So we are just going to click Next at this point to continue forward without our iSCSI network configuration. We're now presented with the Network Attached Storage Server screen, or the NAS screen. NAS is going to mean file. In this particular case, it'll be NFS or CIFS, Samba, SMB configuration. So what does that mean, really? NFS is generally used for Linux-based systems. It's also used on Windows, but it generally comes from the Linux Unix side of the world, and that's the file sharing protocol available through those platforms natively. Samba or CIFS is native to Windows. So you can, again, use Unix or Linux to be able to connect up to this file portion of the infrastructure using CIFS or Samba or SMB, but that's not generally the default protocol that you're going to consume with. So Windows, you're generally going to use CIFS, and Unix, Linux, you're generally going to use NFS. In our particular case, since we're going to cover this in a later module, we are not going to do the configuration now. So we're going to click on Next to continue. We see now that we've gone through the Unisphere configuration wizard. It simply states this concludes the initial configuration wizard. You can change the configuration settings in the future through the settings section of the dialogues. So we're going to go ahead and click on Close, and that's going to shut our initial configuration wizard screen. We're now presented with the Unity VSA Unisphere dashboard.